I have to say I'm not nervous in front of my class anymore. Maybe that lasted just a year when I first started teaching. I was nervous. I've taught so long. I am not nervous in front of my students, but somehow I'm always a little nervous in front of you all, even though you really are very friendly faces. I'm sure I have no reason to be nervous. But and again, since I do teach freshman composition, I don't at work get to talk about books, and so it may not come naturally to me, so we'll see how it goes. And also, I never really know what a book review is. And so what my approach to a book review is, well, first of all, I don't want to just summarize the book, because if you've read the book, you know what's in the book. And if you haven't read the book, I hate to ruin it for you. So I don't just want to summarize it. What I do to prepare is, of course, I read the book, and then I read reviews of the book, and I watch and read a lot of interviews by the author, especially this author, Maggie O'Farrell. Y'all should just check out on YouTube an interview from her, because she is Scottish. She has such a beautiful accent, and it just adds to how I feel about this book. Sometimes when I'm reading the words, I can sort of hear her voice. And so what I have for you here is like a collection of things that interested me. So I hope they interest you too. And maybe they're all over the map. I don't know. So a lot of these things are quotations from the author, some points from book reviews, and some of my own ideas. So, but please stop and add to the discussion or take us in another direction if you want, because that's what makes it really interesting. Okay, so the last time I spoke to you all, it was about the book Becoming Mrs. Lewis and by Patti Callahan. And I had mentioned that I don't always read historical fiction. It's not my go-to, although recently I guess it has been with the books I've been doing for you all. But what was interesting with Patti Callahan, do you remember she talked about that book as, and her approach to that kind of historical fiction is like the bones, the skin, and the clothes, where she said the bones of that book were the true, like, historical facts that she researched and knew about. And then the skin were all the things that happened. You know, she's just not exactly sure how they happened or when they happened. And then she said the clothes were like how she imagined conversations going. But really, that book, her book, was a lot of bones and skin. And do you all remember that she even had C.S. Lewis's stepson read the manuscript or the book, and he loved it and sort of approved of it. Not that she wanted his, you know, wasn't counting on his approval, but he did approve it. So this is different. In this case with Hamnet, and notice the subtitle is A Novel of the Plague. It's also called historical fiction, but it's just very different than the kind of historical fiction from Becoming Mrs. Lewis, because really when I was thinking about it, there are just a few bones here, a few like historical fact, and most of the book, I guess we would call the clothes. I mean, there's probably not much skin even, there's just a few bones and a lot of clothes. Okay, that's sort of a weird way to start this discussion for someone who wasn't here last time, but that's sort of what I was thinking about it. She calls a lot of this book, as she wrote it, idle speculation, how she imagined one way it could have happened. But keep that in mind. I don't know how y'all felt about reading it. I read this for my another book group I'm in like 5 months ago, and one of my friends told me later, like, I have to say, when I heard this was the book you picked, I wasn't really eager to read a book about the plague when we were living through coronavirus. And you know, when I picked it, I hadn't seen the subtitle. Maybe I wouldn't have picked it, but I feel the book is, of course, about so much more than that, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. Okay, so in case you're wondering what are the bones or what fact is in this book, here's some things I found. Well, first of all, the plague. The plague did lay waste to England, and especially London, repeatedly during Shakespeare's professional life. So in 1592, again in 1603, 1606, 1609. And I said, whenever deaths from the disease exceeded 30 per week, the London authorities closed the playhouses during Shakespeare's time. Interestingly, it is not known if Shakespeare's son Hamnet died from the plague. They know when he died, and they know where he's buried, but in the records it did not say that he died of the plague, and we don't know. And also, interestingly, Shakespeare never referred to the plague in any of his plays or his poems, evidently. Not that I've read them all, but that's what I read. So for such a reoccurring, disaster to be happening and for him not to mention it in any of his plays and poetry, I found that interesting. Okay, so we know the plague happened about that time. We know Shakespeare was married to Anne Hathaway. So maybe when you were reading it, you're like, well, who's Agnes? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And he did have 3 children. Susanna, who was born in 1583, which was 6 months after Anne Hathaway, Agnes, and Shakespeare were married. And then they had Hamnet and Judith in 1589. And Hamnet did die at age 11. So that is fact. We just don't know how he died. There were 2 households very closely connected. Shakespeare's, Agnes, the kids, and Shakespeare's parents. But it's not clear if they lived in the way that was described in this book. I think there were 2 properties next to each other or very close to each other, but they don't know if Shakespeare, Agnes, and the kids were in that one, or if they all lived sort of together in both of the structures. But this is the way she imagined it. We do know that when he retired, Shakespeare moved back to Stratford, which we'll talk about that in a minute. And we know that throughout his career, he would take his earnings and send them back to his family. So even though, like, we might imagine William Shakespeare living in London and sort of leading a separate life, we know that he always sent money back to the family, showing that he was not indifferent to his wife, and we'll talk about that in a second. Also, as far as what is fact or whatever, I did hear an interview that the author wanted to make her descriptions as historically accurate as possible. So when she was describing the house and the floor and even the bedding, like, she would stop and do research on those so that the floor she described is really like the floor that would have been there at that time. So that is historically accurate. She said she did not use Elizabethan dialogue because, who wants that? But she said she did use her words carefully. She avoided using words in the book that have a different meaning now, or that would not convey the same idea. And so even with the wording, even though it wasn't Elizabethan language, she was very careful with the words that she chose to tell the story. So here's what the author says. There are very few facts known about Shakespeare. I think we all know that there are very few facts. He left us a very sketchy account of himself. He didn't even take steps to preserve his work for posterity. It's only thanks to his friends and colleagues who collected the plays into the first folio after Shakespeare died. So the first hurdle for her as an author was lack of facts rather than too many facts. And she said, but it worked because she wanted to focus on the untold story of Shakespeare's home life. And, really, not that much is known about Shakespeare, but probably what is known is what was going on in London, but she really wanted to focus on what could be going on at home. There is a very strong and valid reason why biographers focus on Shakespeare's life in London rather than on his family in Stratford, and that's because of his career and his writing, which continues to shape us as human beings. The stage and London is where the action is for scholars, but she always thought the biggest drama of Shakespeare's life happened off stage. And she believes, in her imagining, that really probably the biggest drama was the death of his son, Hamnet, at age 11. Okay, what I like about this book is we see Shakespeare as a husband, as a father, as a son, and in all those different ways. Okay, but do you know that she never, I mean, of course you know if you read it, she never called him William or Shakespeare. And so at first when I was reading, I'm like, who's the tutor? You know, and or, you know, who's the son of the glover? You know, so she had all these other names for him instead of calling him, you know, William or Shakespeare. So she would call him the tutor or her husband or the son of the glover or things like that. It took me a little bit to get used to that. And here's what she said. I think this is funny when they asked, why didn't you call him by his name? And she said, well, I just couldn't because, you know, I mean, his name carries so much heft. And I just felt I couldn't write his name in a sentence like, William Shakespeare came downstairs and had porridge for breakfast. She said, you know, even saying it makes me laugh. And you just feel instantly, you just feel like an idiot. And so I call him, you know, he's always he. He doesn't have a name. He's the husband, or he's the father, or the playwright, or the actor. I needed people, in a sense, to forget who he is. I wanted them to think about him as a human being. And that really did work for me. And that's what I liked about this book, is I got, you know, of course, it's not fact, but I got to imagine what, you know, Shakespeare's life was like as a dad or as a husband, or, you know, what his daily life might have looked like a little bit outside of London. Okay, but in my mind, I believe the main character is Agnes. I think, you know, because she's there all the time. You know, he's off in London and the kids are off doing what they do, but she's there the whole time. And how interesting is that? Now, we all know her as Anne Hathaway. You know, the one time I went to England, I visited Anne Hathaway's cottage or garden or whatever. And so again, when I was reading this, I'm like, who's Agnes? But she explained that when she saw Anne Hathaway's father's will, he called her Agnes. And she thought, well, he should know. He's the dad. And she just thought, you know what, we're going to sort of reclaim that name for her and call her that. Now, what I've read a little bit is in Elizabethan times, names could shift and adjust a little bit. So Agnes, Anne, very close together. Same thing with Hamnet. Hamnet and Hamlet were the same name. The spelling was different, but from every source I read, it's interchangeable, it's the same name. And that, of course, becomes important later. So O'Farrell wanted to give that identity back to Agnes. And, okay, so I don't know if you had any image of Agnes or Anne Hathaway just from your studies when you were reading Shakespeare or whatever. I mean, there wasn't that much focus on her, but the accounts that some of us heard about her, they range from invisibility, like we just didn't know anything about her, to claims that she was ugly or stupid, or that she was reviled by her husband. And that is something that I had heard over the years, like they didn't have a close marriage and like, you know, he might not have loved her or whatever. Okay, and then she says, the author says, from scholarly text to popular culture, we're told Shakespeare's wife was an older woman, a peasant. We're told he did not want to be with her, that she trapped him into marriage. We're drip-fed this image. I started to feel anger about how domestic life is diminished. People want to believe Shakespeare appeared in London fully formed and that he did not have a domestic life, which is interesting because he was so young. And so, like, in our mind, it's like, poof, and there's William Shakespeare, you know, this great playwright, and he just was successful from the beginning and had this life in London. So she really wanted to, and I love this, she said she wanted people, or recommends that people stop asking, why did Shakespeare marry her? And instead ask, why did she marry him? because people think of her as a cradle-snatching yokel who married a younger man, but her family, as we read, was wealthy. They had a successful sheep farm. And so she kept thinking, the author, why would a 26-year-old woman with a good dowry and a secure home want to marry this fellow? He had no trade and he was only 18. And that's a very interesting question, isn't it? To sort of flip it around and, give her a little bit of credit there. As the daughter of a 16th century sheep farmer, Agnes Hathaway was quite likely illiterate, but O'Farrell locates in her character a very specific intelligence, a deep connection with the natural world, which she evokes in exquisite detail, which we're going to talk about in just one second. And again, we don't know if that's true or not, but I like the way she envisioned her because I have read a lot of Shakespeare over the years, as many of you have, and how Shakespeare writes about flowers and birds and the natural world. And I like how she envisioned that, well, maybe some of that knowledge came from her. And so an example in this book is the honey that Agnes collects from the comb oozes, quote, slow as sap, orange gold, scented with the sharp tang of thyme and the floral sweetness of lavender. The author does a great job of evoking all that's within that. A kingfisher is, a quote, a jewel-backed arrow piercing the silver skin of the brook. In O'Farrell's mind, Agnes is not only beautiful. There was one portrait of her that was made more than 80 years after her death. And I haven't seen it, but supposedly, she was pretty, not ugly, and a talented, in the author's mind, she was a talented herbalist, which was heartbreaking too, when her both children were sick and she was like trying to think of what she could do to save them and what she could create that had been successful in other areas, but of course she couldn't. Having identified various plant references in Hamlet, Ophelia's botanical cures, for example, and several metaphors relating to falconry, there and in The Taming of the Shrew, O'Farrell decided to give this knowledge to Agnes as a way of suggesting a partnership of two minds with her husband. Meticulous as ever in her research, O'Farrell learned to fly a kestrel in the Scottish borders, and she had written one scene with the kestrel where she had described the kestrel landing on Agnes's glove with a thud. But when the author herself went out and learned how to do this, she said, when I actually flew a kestrel, I realized they weigh less than a kitten. They're kind of a light, magical creature, so it wouldn't land with a thud. Little known fact there. Okay, and then also she said, in fact, Shakespeare at the end of his career was a millionaire, I guess in today's standards, as well as a great writer. He could have done and bought whatever he wanted, but instead he went back to Stratford, and throughout his career he would send his money home. O'Farrell says, someone who regretted a marriage would not have done that. And it was the image that has been created of her that frustrated me a lot and horrified me. And this rage is also the engine of Hamlet. I want people to forget what they know about Anne Hathaway and think instead about Agnes Shakespeare, because the writer explains that was her real name. And now, the problem with historical fiction, in my mind, is now that's who she is and was. And that's where Shakespeare got that knowledge. And, maybe it was. But I like her way of thinking that of all of these allusions to nature and mentions of nature in Shakespeare's plays and poetry, where did that come from? And maybe it came from her. But I do think it's great to help her reclaim her name, Agnes. Okay. And so the author here imagines their marriage as being one filled with tenderness, longing, and mutual respect. And, I think what we see here too, it's probably not that easy to be married to a genius. And I wouldn't know. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding, Gordon, if you're watching this later. Okay, I just had to say that. Okay, so she said, with this book, I wanted to give voice to Hamlet and his mother and sisters to imagine what life had been like in the Glover's house in Henley Street and how the tragic events of August 1596 might have played out. And I think it was very convincing. Did you all? Just to get a glimpse of what daily life was like. I had never really paused to think much about daily life in Elizabethan times. And she said, Hamnet's story has been eclipsed, his short life relegated to a literary footnote. He gets very little mention in any of his father's biographies. His mother has too often been inexplicably maligned and misrepresented. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how she wrote this book. When the author was 16 in school in Scotland, they were reading Hamlet, and her favorite teacher, just as an aside, mentioned, and Shakespeare had a son who was named Hamnet who died when he was 11. And then, that was all she heard about that. And that stuck with her and interested her. And then she went to college, and she said she took a lot of courses on Shakespeare. She read a lot of biographies about Shakespeare because she was interested. And really, she never read anything about Hamnet, the son. And I wonder if you all had ever heard of that before you read this book. My Shakespeare knowledge is limited, but goes back many years. When I was in graduate school, one course I took was a 3-hour course on Hamlet. So every Wednesday night for 3 hours, I would sit at a little round table and work our way through Hamlet. And let me tell you, not once in that semester did the professor ever mention anything about Shakespeare's family life, or certainly did not mention that he had a son named Hamnet, which is basically Hamlet, which you'd think he could mention because we were spending 3 hours at a clip reading Hamlet, but it never came up. So anyway, thank goodness that her teacher just mentioned that in passing, and then she just kept coming back to it over the years, thinking about it. And she wanted to write this book, but she got married, she had kids, and she felt she could not write this book until her son was past the age of 11. She said that she might have been a little superstitious or something, but she just said she couldn't bring herself to write about the death of a young boy at age 11 when her son hadn't reached that age. And her son, I read today, said, boy, you're going to give me a great 12th birthday party, aren't you? And so once he was 12, then she could start writing it. And interestingly, the part where she wrote the chapter about when he died and how he was laid out, she could not write that in her house. She just thought, I can't bring that into my house. And so she said there's a little shed out back, and she would go and write that chapter away from her house in the shed. And she said she would write it just 15 minutes at a time. She'd write 15 minutes and then take a break and come back and, write 15 minutes. And, that she just could not bring that sadness into the house, which I thought was interesting. Okay, and then the other thing, so she didn't think it was fair for people to malign Anne or Agnes, and she also didn't appreciate the implication that in Elizabethan times, because so many children died, that it probably wasn't a really big deal if a family had 3 kids and lost one, because so many kids die and it wasn't unusual. And she really did, even though it was much more common, she said it's wrong to assume that it was easier for people to accept. And I'm sure that is true. And so she said, it's a terrible assumption to make that people didn't feel their children's deaths as profoundly as we might, just because it was a more present threat. I refuse to accept that any people ever are able to resign themselves to it. I think that family grieved deeply for Hamnet. How could they not? You only have to read the opening scenes of Hamlet or consider the separated boy and girl twins in Twelfth Night to comprehend this. Okay, so, and then the other thing, I want to do 2 more points here. How she talked about the plague. boy, if this sentence doesn't keep you reading, I don't know what will. Okay. For the pestilence to reach Warwickshire, England, in the summer of 1596, two events need to occur in the lives of two separate people, and then these people need to meet. And then, so that chapter, if you haven't read the book yet, was so powerful, interesting, and especially I feel like with us living through COVID, like how it happened. Those two people met, and then so it started in Alexandria when a plague-carrying flea leaps off a tame monkey and onto a young cabin boy, and ending in Stratford with Hamnet's twin sister Judith opening a flea-infested package of Venetian beads.
Excuse me, a package of what?
Venetian beads, beads
okay.
from Venice.
Okay.
So it had landed, the flea was in this package, that the daughter then opened the package and the flea was there.
And it started in Alexandria.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
And so that chapter alone, in fact, let me just see if that's true. It's sort of a standalone chapter that just focuses on how that flea, the plague, made its way to Stratford, England. I'm like, don't open the package. Okay. So I thought that was a beautiful description. And she looked at maps. The author looked at these maps and did all this research about trading at that time and how it might have happened.
I was just struck by the lack of mention by Shakespeare about the plague. So, for what it's worth, I mean, to Google on it and look at the the Wikipedia, whatever. I gathered that the famous bubonic plague, the main one, is actually the late Middle Ages in the 14th century. That's wiped out a huge
Yes.
portion of the European population. And there was another one back in the 6th century or something like that. But that actually, in the late 16th century, there really wasn't a pandemic. I mean,
Right.
There really wasn't a severe pandemic plague, but the bubonic plague never fully went away. I mean, there's still people that in funny countries around the world, remote, that still get it to this day, so it hasn't.
Well, that is
completely gone away.
exactly what I did this morning,
Yeah.
because I was trying to get my dates straight. And so I Googled the bubonic plague, and then it came up and it was like, here are the symptoms. And I'm like, symptoms? Like, oh my gosh, like it's still around. And then I saw how in the Middle Ages, and I had cut and pasted that quotation here, and then I was like, okay, we're talking about a different thing. So then I deleted it. But yes, in the Middle Ages, that's when it wiped out, like, I mean, I can't remember if it was 70% or something crazy of Europe.
Right.
And so then I'm like, well, what are we talking about here? And so then, it was nothing like that. However, it kept reappearing in London especially, and I thought that was interesting. If more than 30 cases were discovered, they would shut down the theater and then, wait and then bring it back. Yeah, and so that quotation I found talked about 4 different waves that hit London especially hard at that time. But that's exactly what I Googled this morning, and that's right. So all of that it's like still there are symptoms. Don't read them of bubonic plague, and it was not the Black Death of Europe the century before that.
On a different note, I like the way the book sort of sidesteps the achievement of Shakespeare as a playwright.
Yes.
Because I don't know how it is today, but I was impressed with the controversy over the true authorship of
Yes.
the Shakespeare plays. I mean, there was this theory
Mm-hmm.
that, well, this simple son of a glover from Stratford couldn't have had this kind of intense, intimate knowledge of the royal court and be that well-traveled to know about Italy, Europe, and Egypt, and all these places, and the intense, detailed knowledge displayed and they're bound to be somebody else, that he was the workhorse, because
Right.
he had the job of producing the plays, and actually is really just hard work,
Yeah.
And that really somebody else was the genius behind creating all these lines. And I say genius in quotation marks because as children, many of us were made to memorize things from Shakespeare.
I was.
And then later in life, you realize, oh, well, compared to the Bible, which was, Shakespeare was almost as popular on people's shelves at one time as the Bible, but compared to the Bible, the so-called wisdom of particularly the characters of Shakespeare isn't very wise. So some of the things that we memorize are, wait a minute,
Well, I remember my Shakespeare professor, really did not love the quotation, to thine own self be true. And he was like, oh, Polonius was such a blowhard, that didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And I was just reading, that's just what my professor said. I don't have a position on that. But I was reading some famous person, they were like, what quote means something to you? And she was like, it's like my mother would tell me all the time, to thine own self be true. And I'd be like, well, I don't know about that. But anyway, so very interesting. And my professor at that time, because it's always a topic, was it Shakespeare, or who wrote it? Was it several people, blah, blah, blah. And I just remember, and I was young at the time, and this has stayed with me, that my professor said, well, it was either Shakespeare or someone who called himself Shakespeare. So, good enough for me. Very interesting. Okay, so there are a few passages I want to read, 2 passages. I could go on, but I won't. This is let me tell you what has stuck with me. Hold on a sec. Okay, well, this is not what has stuck with me, but this evokes sort of the feeling of their marriage. And it says and she says, she doesn't know what his issue is at home, he's just not all there or whatever. And she said, do you wish we had not wed? Is that it? And he turns to her for what feels like the first time in many days, and his face is pained, aghast. He presses his hand down on top of hers. No, he said, never. How could you say such a thing? You and Susanna are all I live for. Nothing else matters. Well, what is it then? And he says, nothing. I don't know, nothing. A heaviness of spirit, a melancholy. It's nothing. And then she is just falling into sleep when he says or seems to say, I'm lost. I have lost my way. Which I just thought was beautifully written. And then for her just to find a way to just say, you've got to go to London, and have him go off. I like that image. But here's what I keep coming back to all the time. I just think this is so moving. And it was after he died, after the son died, and she's coming to grips with it. And I just think any of us who have children could relate to this. And she said, she, like all mothers, constantly casts out her thoughts like fishing lines towards her children, reminding herself of where they are, what they are doing, how they fare. From habit, while she sits there near the fireplace, some part of her mind is tabulating them and their whereabouts. Judith, upstairs, Susanna, next door, and Hamnet. Her unconscious mind casts again and again, puzzled by the lack of bite, and the answer she keeps giving it, he is dead, he is gone. And Hamnet, the mind will ask again, at school, at play, out at the river, and Hamnet, where is he? I just think, I do that with my kids. Okay, where's Helen today? Where's my son? And how the mind just wants to keep track, the mind of a mother or a parent wants to keep track of where everyone is. So, and in an interview, I heard her read that passage, and coming from her beautiful Scottish accent, it's even more beautiful. But, so that's what I have. So it's redeeming, sort of, Agnes, reclaiming her name. It's not just about William Shakespeare. In fact, he's never mentioned. Oh, and then the end, when she hears that he has a play named Hamnet. Can't you just relate to that? And she was like, what she was appalled that she saw that his play was Hamlet. And she said, why would her husband have done it? Why pretend that it means nothing to him? Just a collection of letters. How could he thieve this name? And she was like, I'm going to go to London and give him a piece of my mind. And so she said she has seen all she needs to see. It's just as she feared. He has taken the most sacred and tender of names and tossed it in among a jumble of other words in the midst of a theatrical pageant. So it's not that easy to get to London, but she gets to London and she's like at the play ready to give him a piece of her mind. And then she stands there and watches, and it says, Hamlet, here on this stage is two people, the young man alive and the father dead. He is both alive and dead. Her husband has brought him back to life in the only way he can. As the ghost talks, he sees that her husband, in writing this and taking the role of the ghost, has changed places with his son. Anecdotally, she heard, and we don't know if it's true, that Shakespeare did play the role of the ghost in the first performance of the play in London. And so that's what she based this on. And then, and then that just opened her eyes to that. So good. Such a good book. Okay, what did I miss and what interested you all? Yes.
Well, I know you say you don't want to tell what happened in the story, but please, I've read all of it. I'm going to be able to. I've got so many other things to read. And maybe I skipped parts or anything, but I don't know what happened to Judith. She was stricken with the illness, and the first one to look after her was her twin brother, who searched and
Right.
said, where is he? It was where was everybody else? I mean, he was out looking for everybody, couldn't find them, and finally when they came, it seemed like it was just in time, and it seemed like her potions were being beneficial to Judith, but did she survive?
She did survive. And that's another scene that stayed with me because
Yeah.
I know my kids have been in that situation. I've been in that where you're there and you're like, where is everybody? Where is everyone when I need him? And he's looking all over and he can't find them. But yes, so she got better. And so they were so relieved. They thought they had overcome this situation. And then they looked at Hamnet later and he got sick from
But
being close to
So
her.
if she was able to be successful, she was.
Yeah,
You had this great faith in her.
yes,
She was wiser and more effective than the doctors.
Yes.
The doctors were mad at her because
right.
she ruined their business because she was a successful person with her potions, and they weren't.
But it wasn't, she couldn't save
She
him.
couldn't-
She could not save her son.
So it shows her trying. That's the part
Yeah.
I missed. I mean, I thought, well,
Yeah,
he's going to die. I know that. I just don't want.
I know. Yeah, so she survived. And then Susanna lived, and Susanna married a banker later in life, and she was the executor. Shakespeare named her the executor of his estate. And then Judith lived, and I can't remember what I read about her, but like she had a more interesting life. I can't remember what happened.
I think I read somewhere that Judith did not marry well.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And Susanna did.
Right. And Susanna and her mother and father are buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, England.
And she is not. And
Yes, she is.
I think Hamnet is there, but
No, Hamlet and Judith are both in the graveyard.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, good. What else struck
Well,
y'all?
Old Brenda Ann Hathaway's cottage,
Yes.
was that the home?
Well,
that it
I
was
read
named
that
for
there,
her?
I think that was her home later. But I don't think that, and I need to go back and look that up, but I don't think that was the home that is depicted here. Because remember, then they were building another house or whatever. That might have been the other house. But I think there was a structure where his parents lived and they were there. But in the book, it was like they had their own little separate apartment, and it might not have been like that in real life. They might have all been in the same one, but I don't know I don't think that was Anne Hathaway's cottage. Maybe that was later.
And I
I'm not
wondered
sure.
If that was a family home and it was named for her.
Yeah.
Because she was primary.
Yeah,
She was the one.
she was there. I will look that up. I'll
And
take
then in the
sure.
book, I noticed that after Hamlet died, there was no mention of the play
Yeah,
in that book.
That's
all the
right.
way through.
That's right.
And we congregated in here and there, and everybody went around their normal.
That's right. And I forgot to mention, Hamlet, the play, was written 4 years after Hamnet died. That's when it happened.
I apologize for my lateness. It's a lot of detours.
I know.
I wonder if you would comment on the title. It seems to me that there was very little about Hamnet and more about Shakespeare's wife. It seems to me that the title would have been more appropriate.
Like Agnes.
Shakespeare's wife.
Yes. Well, I think that since Hamlet is, one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, and still, people haven't figured out exactly what Hamlet is all about. That's why I took that 3-hour class and still don't know what it's all about. And there are a lot of deep mysteries.
Would have been
And
a good title to
yeah.
attract buyers.
Yeah, it would, but I think why she called, I don't know why she called it that, but I think the case could be made that like this love, it focuses on his love of family and of grief, and what that grief, how he poured that grief into his art to keep him alive the only way he could. But exactly, I was sort of expecting it to be about Shakespeare, and I feel it's more about Agnes than Shakespeare, and it's probably more about Agnes than Hamnet, but I think the Hamnet connection is how that ties into the play, his most famous play, Hamlet, and grief. That would be my guess. I don't know. Okay, what else? Those are great comments.
Did anybody see the movie, decades ago now, The Young Shakespeare, starring a man named Fiennes? And I've
Yeah.
forgotten that play, but it certainly depicts him as a rather randy, gambler sort of young person. And this book kind of has that a little bit.
Yeah.
With it, in fact, paints such a romantic first meeting
Yeah,
with Agnes that
Yeah.
It really very effectively creates the tension that
Mhm.
builds up later between the home life versus the career.
Yeah.
It's a genuine tearing of the soul, for
Yeah.
both of them.
Yeah.
They have that problem.
interesting. Yes.
I thought it was interesting in reading, as you're reading the book, and Shakespeare has gone to England so often, writing his plays and all. And you get the idea, or at least I did in reading the book, well, he's living the good life in London. And then when you get toward the end, and you find out that he's living near poverty level,
Right.
just so he could send
Send
his
money
money back
home.
home to Stratford.
That did strike me too, because, before I read this, I thought, he's off living, this great life in London, but actually he was saving all the money. They do know he sent money back. So that is a fact, that he sent money back home. So I don't know exactly what his living situation was, but he was living the kind of life where he would have money to send home. Anything else? Yeah.
I'd like to weigh in on the on versus Agnes.
Okay.
She, in page 38 of it.
Yeah.
She does pronounce her name Agnes, and so I was a French teacher and I speak French, and so I understand that if you can say on
Yes.
is the first syllable in Agnes,
Good.
and this talks about how one must lean into the first syllable, then skip over the next. So if you do that,
Right.
you're left with on.
Right. And I don't mean, I think, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think that that's how, with the names and writing, she was illiterate, I don't think people were like, let's strip her of the name. But now you see how it would happen, that Anne would be picked up and, and that's what they go with instead of Agnes, or the beautiful way you say it. But yes, that is an understanding of how that could happen, I think. A great explanation. And Hamnet and Hamlet, I understand too, because spelling, there are all different kinds of ways to spell things. Okay, yeah.
Well, Shakespeare probably was far from being what would be considered today, you know, an evangelical Christian, you know, and far from that probably, you know, but I like to think of, I like to see maybe where there are not any, but religious currents in literature. And so it was very important to bring out this Agnes or Agnes, you know, because that's part of the Catholic Mass, you know, the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God.
No, that's a different spelling. Yeah, that's lamb, the lamb of God.
Yeah, but A-G-N-U-S, Agnus.
But that's different than,
A-G-N is like, we say, Montana, if you speak Spanish,
Yes.
you understand about that Yo sound, and that's what you have in Agnes, but not in the lamb word.
well, I really liked the focus on Shakespeare, William, away from London, what he might have been like at home, what it would be like to be married to him, or, you know, I mean, I'd like to think that some of this is true, you know, and now I think when I think about Shakespeare, I am going to think about him in a slightly different way, not just like the genius who was writing these plays or whatever, but think about the family that was behind. And it's a great story, I think. I think she was a really good writer. And I don't know, I just really always love hearing interviews by an author. So I think y'all should go and just look at a YouTube interview with her. Or she had one on NPR where you don't see her, you just hear her. But just the way she describes what motivated her and what she was trying to do there, I think you'd really like it. All right, well, thank y'all so much. Okay, good.